So I took a poll the other day that was very surprising to me. I asked, which apologetic method do you pretty much align with? And the choices were classical, evidential, presuppositional, or I don't know. And almost half of 59 people since I shot the poll out there said I don't know. And several people said they didn't really know much about apologetic methodology. So I thought I would do a video on what are the different or some of the different apologetic methods. Now, there are a few books that I would recommend, and just on apologetic methodology, there is a book called 5 Views on Apologetics, and there also is a really good book called Faith Has Its Reasons. And I'll have these in the PowerPoint here in a little bit. There's also another book that I would recommend. It used to go by the name of Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, and now it's been renamed the Big Book of Christian Apologetics. So that's what it's called now. So let's look at some of the various methods. But before I get into the actual methods, you might be asking, what is apologetics? So the word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, and it simply means defense. And it can be a defense for anything. So, of course, we're going to be looking at Christian apologetics. But you could be doing apologetics for Islam, Mormonism, capitalism, whether or not there are aliens or UFOs, as I've done in another video. So if you're giving a defense or a reasoned account for something, then you are doing apologetics. And if you're doing apologetics, then you are what's called an apologist. So it doesn't mean to apologize for something. In fact, quite the opposite. It means to give a reasoned account or defense for something. We see this in the Bible in 1 Peter 3:15, for example, and most people point to this verse to justify doing Christian apologetics, because some Christians don't think we can do apologetics or that we should, because they think, and we're going to look at one of these methods here in a little bit, they think that doing apologetics really puts reason, quote unquote, above God, and that we shouldn't do that. But 1 Peter 3:15 says, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. So that word defense there is the word apologia, which can mean defense or can mean reasoned account or anything of that nature. Now, we're going to look at 5 different methods. I'm going to do this pretty quickly, but 5 different methods. And these 5 methods are in the 5 Views book on apologetics. You might want to check that out. So we're going to look at the classical model, the evidential model, presuppositionalism, reformed epistemology, and a combinational or eclectic, or really better called probably a cumulative approach. So let's look at the classical method first. The classical apologetics is a 2-step method. Now, I will go ahead and say up front that I hold to the classical apologetic method. It's one reason my channel is called Classical Theology, because everything to do with pretty much classical theology, classical theism, classical philosophy, classical apologetics. So a classical apologetics is a 2-step method. 2-step method. I was in a debate a year ago, almost to the day actually, and Gary Habermas, one of the people I'm going to be talking about here in this presentation, was sitting on the front row. And later, after the debate, he asked me, are you an apologetic 2-stepper? And I said yes. And I didn't have to ask him what he meant. What that means, if you've been in apologetics for any length of time, you know that apologetics in the classical system is a 2-step method. Okay? And that 2-step method is first to show that God exists. And so Christians who are classical apologists will want to show that God exists first before showing Christianity is true. And the reason that is because we believe it is easier to put the miracles that we see in the Bible into a theistic context. So I know it sounds ridiculous, but there are people who could make the argument, and some people do make these kinds of arguments, that, well, they see a miracle and they say, well, that's just that's this force over here, or That's aliens. In fact, some people think that aliens rose Jesus from the dead. I have a couple of videos, a few videos on aliens and UFOs and that kind of thing, if you like that kind of material. And there are groups of people who think that Jesus either was raised by aliens, or he was half an alien, or he was an alien. And so if you put the miracles in a theistic context, then it just makes more sense. To show miracles and then say, well, God did that, it can be, as William Lane Craig says in the 5 E's book, because he's the classical apologist represented in that book, he says that starting off with miracles and trying to argue argument for God from that point makes the existence of God somewhat ad hoc. Ad hoc. It's a Latin phrase meaning to this. And it really just means that you're making something up to save your view. So we don't want to say God is ad hoc. And it just makes more sense to say that the miracles are in a theistic context to make sense of them. So the two-step method is to show God exists before we get into things like miracles, prophecy, and those sorts of things. Some of the beliefs of the classical model are that one, and I'm only going to cover, there are more beliefs in this, I'm just going to cover a few. One, reason can show God's existence. And this is actually going to be a contentious claim among various Christian apologists, especially with the presuppositionalists. They're going to argue that we don't believe that reason can prove God's existence. Or they don't think that reason can prove God's existence. Also, they believe that there is commonality, that is, the classical apologists believe there is commonality between believers and unbelievers. That is, there's something about the nature of reality and the nature of logic that's the same between those who believe in Christianity and those who do not believe in Christianity. So you have to say, well, why wouldn't there be any commonality? Well, as we're going to see, just to make sense of this right now, I'll jump a little bit ahead. The presuppositionalists will say that we cannot take reality as being understood or interpreted the same way between believers and unbelievers because of sin. And the classical apologist says, no, we believe that believers and unbelievers alike both use the same logic, live in the same physical material world, and can reason to God. And one reason that is because of Romans 1. Romans 1 says, for what can be known about God is plain to them, and he is clearly talking about unbelievers here, Paul is. Paul says, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So Paul is saying here that there are unbelievers, that everyone is without excuse because God has made it plain through creation certain things about his divine power, his divine nature and eternal power. Well, if we can know things about God's divine nature and eternal power through creation, then we can know things about God through creation. Well, if we can know about God through creation, then we can know that he exists through creation. So Romans 1, it seems to me and other classical apologists to say that we can use reason to show God exists through nature, that is, through creation. And wouldn't it make sense? Because God made man, humankind, humans, rational creatures. That's what makes us different from other animals. So we are reasonable, and I argue that and thinking about God, about what he is and what he's not, and pondering about him, that is actually worship. So, I've been to lots of different kind of worship services. I've been a Presbyterian, I've been Pentecostal, I've been Baptist, I've been to chanting services, all kinds of fun things. But one of the ways I think that is really unique and legitimate and genuine in worshiping God is where you see me right now in my office, where I'm reading a book or thinking about God, writing a paper about God or something, and just thinking about what he is, pondering about God's nature. To me, that is actually an aspect of worship, using our reason to think about and consider the things of God. Some proponents of this view, this classical apologetics, would be Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, so those are from the medieval period, Norman Geisler, who was one of my professors, R.C. Sproul, and William Lane Craig. And I have an asterisk by his name because I'm going to actually bring him back up in a different view and say he sort of fits in a different view as well. Now, he did write the classical chapter in the 5 Views book on apologetics. But when he debates, he uses, at least the ones that I've seen, he uses 5 arguments for God's existence. He uses 3 classical proofs, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument from design, and the moral argument. But he also adds on the argument from the resurrection and also experience. Well, that, I think, fits better in the cumulative approach that we're going to look at later. So he is normally seen as a classical apologist, and he does write that chapter in that book. But he's not a classical theist because he rejects some classical attributes of God like simplicity, divine eternality, impassibility, and what he calls a strong sense of immutability. That is, that God doesn't change. So since he brings in arguments that classical apologists don't use, like the resurrection or experience, he might fit well in the cumulative case as well, even though he does use classical arguments. Not everyone would agree with that. Some books on the classical model will be Christian Apologetics. That would be by Norman Geisler, and there's going to be different books by that name, so that's by Norman Geisler. Classical Apologetics, a rational defense of the Christian faith and a critique of presuppositional apologetics, as well as Craig's Reasonable Faith, Christian Truth, and Apologetics. And there are 2 other authors on that middle book on classical apologetics. So it's R.C. Sproul in that one, John Gerstner, and Arthur Lindsley. And that book is interesting because they are Reformed, and they're arguing for a classical view. Now, historically, Reformed people have been classical as well, and there's been a new movement in the Reformed camps that we're going to look at here in just a little bit. I wanted to show Norm Geisler and R.C. Sproul there because Norm Geisler is a well-known, he calls himself a moderate Calvinist. He's not a Calvinist in the normal sense of the term that people use today in the 5-point sense. But R.C. Sproul was. And both camps want to argue for Augustine as well. So you can be Reformed and not Reformed, or not Reformed and be classical, even though a lot of Reformed people today, I don't know of anybody who's a presuppositionalist who's not Reformed. Okay. Some critiques of that view. I think this view is in agreement with Romans 1, that is the classical view. I think it recognizes the rational nature of man in an appropriate way that we can know God through creation. I mean, people have just, in fact, done that. Or other people will mainly presuppositionalists will argue that God cannot be demonstrated from reason, but that simply has been done. I mean, it's not even a matter of debate because it just has, a matter of fact, been done in history with people like Aristotle. Now, Aristotle held to one prime mover per cosmological sphere that he held to based on his cosmology, but people have just, in fact, argued for God's existence apart from the Bible. I mean, the Muslims believe in God, and they didn't base it on the biblical teachings. There were philosophers in the Islamic tradition who argue for God from reason alone. And this also contains positive aspects of other systems. So some people, like in the cumulative camp, will say, well, we're going to take the best points from each position, and then we'll be a cumulative case. Well, I'm going to argue that there's nothing really that I can think of that's good in the other systems that is not already part of the classical model. I think the classical model is great in that it encompasses the entire spectrum of apologetics. So if you're familiar with the 12 points that show Christianity is true, which is in a popular book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, which is a good book in my opinion. Norm used to argue for the 10 points that show Christianity is true. And then someone came up to him and said, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. And so he added 2 more points to the front end of that book, or that system, and said that, well, the first 2 points have to do with truth being objective, and the second point being uh, if something is true, then the opposite of it is false. Then it goes into God's existence, and then the evidences for the Bible and Christianity. So it really is a plug-and-play system. So if you got somebody who believes in truth but not God, you plug them into point 3. If they're a Muslim and think that, well, the Bible is corrupt, you plug them into point 5 and 6. So it's a broad system that you can put anyone, I think, in that system. So that's the classical model. Let's now look at the evidential model. And the evidential model really is just point 2 of the classical model. That is, they want to show the Bible and Christianity is true by way of evidences. Those evidences being the reliability of the Bible, fulfilled prophecy within the Bible, the resurrection, and they may throw in God's existence or proofs for God. But the main difference here is that evidentialists don't think you have to start with God's existence. You can start right with the evidences for Christianity. Again, that's just showing that the Bible is true. Whereas in the classical model, you want to show God exists first before you get into the biblical proof. Because as Norman used to say, you can't show there are acts of God unless you show there is a God who can act. So that's evidential. Some of their beliefs are that they show God's existence is not, they think showing God's existence is not a necessary prerequisite to show Christianity is true. They want to show evidences can show God's existence. They think that giving evidences can show that God exists, like the resurrection. And they also think that reason can prove Christianity is true, so that they would have that in common with the classical guys. All right. Some major proponents here: Joseph Butler, Gary Habermas, Josh McDowell, Michael Licona. They're all going to be evidentialists. Now, some people will make a finer distinction here between evidentialism and historical apologetics. Gary wrote the chapter on the evidential model in the 5 Views book, so I think it's at least appropriate. He identifies himself as an evidentialist, but historical apologetics will argue that we can show that Christianity is true from historical evidences in particular. Some books on that view would include Evidence That Demands a Verdict, again by Josh McDowell, or The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Michael Licona and Gary Habermas. Now, they both believe that you don't have to show that God exists in order to show Christianity is true. They think that if you can convince somebody the resurrection happened, then that person will likely believe that God exists. And I don't disagree with that in principle, because if you can convince somebody that the resurrection did in fact happen, especially as Michael Licona says, if you have all these contextual statements by Jesus saying, well, I'm God, I'm the God of what you guys we consider now as the Old Testament, and I'm going to fulfill the law. He fulfilled prophecies, he did miracles, and he foretold and accomplished his own resurrection. Mike says, well, if given the context, it's a really good argument for Jesus being who he said he was. And I agree with him. It's just, why not put that in a tighter theistic context by first showing that God exists, so that no one can say, well, Mike, there are other possibilities. We don't have to resort to God. Well, if you've already shown God exists, then as C.S. Lewis says, then you can't throw miracles out. You can't disprove miracles. If you grant God, then there's a possibility that miracles can happen. So if you grant God, the door is wide open on miracles at that point. So for a critique on this model, it is practically strong, but logically it doesn't require God's existence. Thus, it allows other options for miracles. And most would be silly, like, well, aliens did it or whatever. But it does allow other options. And it does, as William Lane Craig says, open itself up for the charge that God is ad hoc. Also, the classical model gives a better context, I and other classical apologists would argue. So we should start with truth. The notion that truth is absolute and can be known as objective. In other words, if Christianity is true, then it's true for everybody. And if it's false for everybody. It can't be both true and false. That's the contradiction. Okay, now the model that is the most polar opposite on the scale from classical apologetics and to some degree from evidentialism as well. And that is called presuppositionalism. And this view says we can't use reason to show God exists. We have to presuppose Christianity is true and show that every other worldview fails. So we're going to presuppose, assume, take for granted that Christianity is true. Not just that God exists, but that these 66 books of the Protestant Bible, the Trinitarian view of God, not just monotheism, but everything about Christianity is true in order to show that every other worldview fails. So some beliefs with this view are that there is no common ground contra the classical apologists. There's no common ground between the believer and the unbeliever because of sin. In fact, they argue that we don't even use logic the same way as the unbelievers. And they can be very skeptical, actually, because I had an informal debate discussion with a presuppositionalist. It was my first foray, I guess, into debating, and it was on a radio show and a Facebook radio show. And this person was arguing for presuppositionalism and was charging that if I don't assume God exists and start with the Trinitarian view of God, then I can't even give an account for how I know there's a tree outside my window. So, and that's a pretty skeptical position. In one debate, Greg Bonson said that if he didn't presuppose the Trinitarian view of God and the whole ball of wax of Christianity, he wouldn't even be able to know his car was in the parking lot. So they don't just think that we have to assume monotheism or whatever. They think that you have to show that all of Christianity is true for rationality to even be possible. There's no, if the Christian God doesn't exist, they say, then there is no possibility for rationality as such. Okay, so let's see what they some other beliefs are. So they think that man cannot use autonomous reason to show Christianity is true. So autonomous reason here is a little bit of a curious way of saying things, but they basically mean that if you're not presupposing God, then you're using God apart from God's grace or whatever. And so you're just using autonomous human reason like a pagan philosopher would, they would say. And so since we can't use autonomous human reason to show God God exists or Christianity is true, then we have to presuppose God. Further, they say Christianity can be shown to be true due to the impossibility of the contrary. Now, this phrase has never made sense to me because in logic, to be contrary means you've got two propositions or statements that can both be false. That's just what it means in logic to be contrary. To be contradictory means you've got one statement that must be true and the other statement must be false, or vice versa. One of the two statements must be true and one of the statements must be false. So if I say God exists, then the opposite of that claim would be God does not exist. They would be contradictory. But if I said atheism is true, or I wouldn't say that. If someone said atheism is true, and I said Christianity is true, then those would not be contradictory because logically speaking, there could be a third option that could be true. So logically speaking, and of course I think Christianity is true, but logically speaking, Christianity and atheism could both be false. And because they could both be false, they are considered contrary, not contradictory. So it doesn't make any sense to say that we can show Christianity to be true due to the impossibility of the contrary. We can show Christianity is true, they say, via the transcendental argument. Now, a transcendental argument is an argument that no matter how you go about answering it, whether you affirm it or deny it, you get something being true. So you can say, if Q, therefore P, if not Q, therefore P. No matter if you affirm or deny Q, you're going to get P. Well, the way in which they argue for the transcendental argument is to basically say that God is a prerequisite for the possibility of rationality or reason. Now, the classical guys would say, of course, that God is the ontological necessary condition for anything to exist. That just means that if God didn't exist and didn't cause things to exist, then nothing else would exist. But in this debate, oftentimes we see people confuse these terms or conflate these terms. And so while the classical guys will say we have to maintain God ontologically as a precondition for being, we don't have to know God exists in order to make sense of, say, biology or chemistry or physics or anything else. So yeah, God has to exist in order for there to be living beings, but a person doesn't have to acknowledge God's existence in order to do biology. Now, there is a debate about whether there can be a real atheist, because if Romans 1 is true, then everyone knows God exists through creation. So there's some debate about, well, are there any such things as real atheists if Romans 1 says that there's no one with an excuse because God has made his existence and nature clear to them. So what they want to maintain is that we can show Christianity by some kind of transcendental argument, meaning that God is a precondition for rationality. I don't disagree with that in terms of being necessary for being, but in making this argument, they conflate ontology, the study of being, with epistemology, the study of knowledge. And this is a typical stumbling block for people like me in this debate. This is oftentimes conflated in this debate. Some proponents of this view, Abraham Kuyper probably shouldn't be considered a proponent. He's one who was a kind of like he was the seed for this view. He argued for something similar to this, and he kind of set the stage for this. But we can look back at Abraham Kuyper as somebody who kind of prepared this view to be able to be what it is today. Cornelius Van Til really is the first person to maintain a full-blown presuppositionalism, Cornelius Van Til. And interestingly, he wrote his first book, that I'm aware of anyway, on this topic, in 1976, which is the exact same year Norman Geisler wrote his book on Christian apologetics, arguing for a classical view. Van Til's star pupil was Greg Bahnsen, who wrote and debated using his position. There's a really interesting debate between Greg Bahnsen and R.C. Sproul on a distinction between the classical model that R.C. Sproul held to and the model that Greg Bahnsen held to. Bahnsen also debated an atheist using his model. John Frame was the person in the 5E's book who represented presuppositionalism, but Scott Oliphant probably is the standard bearer today for those who want to maintain the presuppositional view. And then some books on this position: Christian Apologetics by Van Til, not by Geisler, but by Van Til. Presuppositional Apologetics Stated and Defended. And then that's by Bahnsen. And Covenantal Apologetics, Principles and Practice in Defense of Our Faith by Scott Oliphant. Now, as far as the critique, I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself with some of this critique. I think it's just unbiblical. I think the Bible teaches that we can know God exists through nature, through creation. I think it's illogical because it's by definition, and they even admit this, that this is a circular position. That if you assume something and then try to make that your conclusion, that's just what a circular argument is. So if I say if P then Q, and then if Q then P, that's circular. And they even will admit to the circularity here. They just don't think that it is the kind of circularity that causes a problem. And I've already mentioned this part, so I got a little bit ahead of myself, is you can't prove anything to be true due to the impossibility of the contrary, because it's just what it means to be contrary. Contrary means you've got two propositions or statements that can both be false. So showing one to be false doesn't show the other one to be true. Even if you showed every position on the face of the earth in the history of religion, if they're all contrary, then you can show them all to be false, and it will never show the truth of any of the other ones. Only if you have one or more that are contradictory, and that's not what they're saying. So I really don't know what they mean by this, because I don't think they mean in the logical sense of that I've explained it. It seems like they mean it more like a contradiction. But there really isn't a contradiction in this regard, where Christianity must be true and some other position must be true or false. That one has to be true, the other has to be false by some kind of logical constraint. I just don't see that. Certainly positions within Christianity would be contradictory. So, for example, Christians teach that Jesus died. Muslims teach that Jesus did not die. That would be a point where that thinking is contradictory with each other, because either he died or he didn't. It couldn't be both. Couldn't be anything else. Putting aside the nonsensical notion that Jesus didn't exist. He either died or he didn't. There's no other option. And then the transcendental argument that I've been talking about, I don't think has ever been articulated, let alone defended. And interestingly, in a book that Scott Oliphant edited, there is a chapter in that book. The book is called Revelation and Reason, New Essays in Reformed Apologetics, edited by Scott Oliphant and Lane Tipton. There's a chapter in this book that talks about needing to clarify Van Til's argument for the transcendental argument. So he describes what a transcendental argument is, but he never actually, in my opinion, gives that argument. In fact, in the debate between R.C. Sproul and Greg Bahnsen, when Bahnsen is asked by Sproul to give an account of the transcendental argument, he uses logic, like with Aristotle and Immanuel Kant. In other words, if you can't argue against logic without using logic or reason, you can't use reason against reason. Well, that would be a transcendental type argument. But how does that apply to showing God's existence? And both R.C. Sproul and even the moderator couldn't really understand what Bahnsen was saying. So I don't believe, and this is pointed out to me by one of my professors, Richard Howe, I don't believe the transcendental argument ever has been adequately articulated, let alone defended. I don't see where there's an argument that says that given these premises, we have to presuppose God's existence in order to make rationality possible or anything else possible. Now, believe me, if as an apologist and a philosopher, I want to be able to win the arguments, right? So we all want to win our arguments. So if someone could give me a silver bullet argument where no matter what my opponent says, I win the argument, then give me that argument. I'll take it with a smile on my face. I just have never heard it. And I don't think it can be. I would love for it to be made. I'm not against it in principle. I just don't think that it has ever been made. And if you think that I'm wrong, please feel free to leave a comment or point me to a source, because, again, I am not against that in principle. I just don't think that I've ever. And I've read Van Til, I've read Oliphant, I've read Frame, I've read Greg Bahnsen, these guys. I've read these people. I just never have seen it in their writings. Reformed epistemology, the next system. This view says that belief in God is properly basic and does not need defending or evidence. That basically we just have this notion of God in us, and it doesn't need to be argued for, in the sense that the pizza I had for dinner, I don't have to argue for that. Someone says, well, what did you have for dinner? I say, I had pizza. Well, give me an argument. Well, besides just going and get people who saw me eat it, I don't have to provide an argument, or just don't need to do that. It's for my own personal knowledge. I had experiential knowledge of that. But the Reformed epistemology proponents say that we don't need to argue for God's existence, which is properly basic, and it's just part of us as a human being. So they think that God is properly basic and doesn't need evidence, and that's because, at least in part, because of what's called the sensus divinitatis, or the divine sense. That is, that we have a sense of God built into our very essence of what it means to be a human. They also believe, at least some of them, that disbelief is due to sin. Now, honestly, all of us believe disbelief is due to sin. But they're going to argue that the reason that people will say that they don't have God, since they have this, supposedly this divine sense in them, this internal, like innate notion of God that's just built into them, the only way they think we can explain why people don't believe in it is just sin and suppression. I would argue that that's true, that the reason that people don't believe is because of sin. Because, like Romans 1 says, there is evidence around all of us because of creation, and people know God exists, and they suppress that knowledge. And the only thing left is things that is wrong and false. But they do think that reason can either prove God they think that reason can prove God's existence is rational. I don't think I've ever heard anyone of them think that reason can ipso facto show God does in fact exist. But some of them believe that that reason can show that belief in God is at least rational, such as, for example, Alvin Plantinga, who came up with this position, and he really did not intend for it to be an apologetic method. It's just kind of taken on that kind of effect, I guess. That kind of just became that method. Kelly James Clark argues for this position in the Five Views book. And some of the books there would include Faith and Rationality by Plantinga and Nicholas Wolterstorff, as well as some others. As far as the critique in here, some argue, like Craig does in the Five Views book, that there is no sensus divinitatis, and that's not clearly taught in Scripture. Some will give, and Plantinga brings this out as an objection to his own position. And this is the Great Pumpkin objection. Now, well, if we can just say God is properly basic, why can't I just say, well, the Great Pumpkin exists? I don't need any arguments for that. And that's not very impressive for Plantinga. He argues that the notion of God, because we have this divine sense, we have this thing with the Great Pumpkin, if you like Charlie Brown and Linus like I do. And I tend to watch that with my children on Halloween, watch the great Charlie Brown's, what's it called, a Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown. And some will argue that this is not enough to prove Christianity. That if you just have a divine sense and show God is simply just rational to believe in him, then that's not enough to prove Christianity. And that would be a critique if they were trying to do that. I don't know if they all are or not. Some would be, or some would just use the notion of God, the sensus divinitatis, the inner sense of God, to show that belief in God is rational. And then the combinational or cumulative approach is called the cumulative approach in the book, the Five Views book, or eclecticism is what I'm calling it. This tries to show God and Christianity are true from a combination or accumulation of the above various methods, trying to take the good from this method and the good from that method to make a cumulative case for God or from Christianity. Here's a chart from the book. Paul Feinberg is the proponent of this in the Five Views book. And he has here external aspects as well as internal aspects. Some external aspects being the various theistic proofs, like the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, religious experience, moral behavior, maybe even a moral argument from there. Then revelation, such as the Bible and prophecy, deity and resurrection of Christ. Those are all external aspects. And the internal aspects would be a subjective, whereas the external is an objective approach, the internal aspect is a subjective approach, where we have the believer experiencing illumination and certitude from the Holy Spirit, and the unbeliever having a conviction and innate knowledge of God through his conscience as well, and having, as Romans 2 says, his conscience would be bearing witness against him. So that's the cumulative case. Some of their beliefs is that reason can prove God, or at least prove God rational, or prove belief in God to be rational. And there's various ways that are used, like theistic proofs, historical arguments, experience, etc., to show that Christianity is true. And then the evidence taken cumulatively, they say, establishes Christianity. So if one wanted to say that at least the properly basicality of God's existence doesn't show Christianity is true, then maybe these other kinds of ways. So then we have the evidence that's taken cumulatively and therefore establishes Christianity. Some proponents of this view would be Paul Feinberg, Doug Grotice, and I have a question mark here about William Lane Craig. He is the classical proponent in the Five Views book. I think he's normally thought of as a classical apologist, but he does use arguments in his debates like the resurrection and experience, which to me would seem to go along more with a cumulative type approach. And not everyone would agree with me on that, and that's just fine. Some books here would be Grotice's Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for biblical truth, and he pretty much just states that he's a cumulative he doesn't use that word, but he basically says all these evidences taken together show Christianity is true. As far as a critique, the good points of the above methods are all inherent, I'm going to argue, in the classical model, because the classical model takes everything into account, from the nature of reality to truth, God's existence, prophecies, miracles being able to show that God's prophets and messengers are legitimately from him, that the Bible is reliable, Jesus claimed to be God, proved it with his resurrection, his sinless life, his fulfillment of prophecy, and pretty much giving you, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And then everything that can be argued against that. So I don't think there's anything in these other models that are good that are not already present in the classical model. And that thought isn't new to me. I got that from Richard Howe, as I've gotten many things from him. So thanks, Richard. And miracles, I think, are better explained in a theistic context and make God's existence less ad hoc, as William and Craig wanted to say is the possible objection to something like the evidential kind of model. Experiential arguments really are not very persuasive and can be used by anyone for anything. They can just be made up, or somebody can be deceived. So if a Christian wants to use evidential arguments to show Christianity is true, then why reject experiential arguments from other religions like a Muslim or a Mormon, who I've seen have a very experiential and emotional testimony in talking to us in their church, or they call it a ward. So I think there are some good points in these other methods. Like, I think there are good evidences for Christianity, and I think that we do need to take into account presuppositions, but we do that in the classical model as well. Now, some sources to be mindful of that I've been pointing to a lot have been 5 Views on Apologetics, a book called Faith Has Its Reasons, and then the Big Book of Christian Apologetics, otherwise known as the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. So I hope this has been valuable and interesting to you. If it has, and I ask you to please like and maybe even subscribe to the channel, and please leave comments if you have any questions or anything that would be interesting or you want to know more about. I appreciate the responses to the poll that I took, and I hope this has been helpful, and thanks for tuning in.